Peace be upon you. Good evening. I would like to welcome you live on air in a new episode of Belahodood without borders. The four countries blockading Qatar issued a communique that was pronounced by their foreign ministers in a press conference held today in Cairo after a meeting that had started in the morning. This communique expressed unclear vision, disappointing objectives, void structure, weak demands, and hazy future steps. After the threats that they launched, along with their 13 demands, almost 2 weeks ago, as if they're going to launch the Third World War against Qatar if it doesn't reply to their demands in 10 days. They showed up today before the reporters in Cairo, and the reporters' questions were very provocative and very instigating, and those foreign ministers seemed hazy, confused, unable to answer. Their positions, their performances was disappointing and regretful, both from a political and historical perspective. They seemed to be looking for words that had no meanings. Empty and void expressions lost meanings. They were taking very hazy and very disappointing positions, very disappointing objectives. After the menaces and the threats, they went back wearing Trump's shoes, as was mockingly described by some bloggers and tweeters. We would like to read into this landscape with one of the most important former American officials who was responsible about the dialogue with those countries, Tom Malinowski, who is the assistant of the former Secretary of State during the Obama administration. And he stayed in position until the last few weeks, and he was responsible for following up on the support of the nascent democracies and the protection of activists in closed societies and the fight against corruption. He visited those four countries in the last few years to guarantee that the U.S. administration's foreign policies truly reflect their values. He also presented a lot of statements about these countries, specifically Egypt, before the Congress. The last statement he made happened mid-June, a few weeks ago. From 2001 until 2013, he was the director of Human Rights Watch in Washington. And under the former U.S. President Bill Clinton, he was the senior director responsible for writing the foreign policy speeches in the National Security Council, and he also wrote the speeches of Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher. He is an Oxford grad, and he worked there as a researcher as well as a researcher in California, Berkeley University. Mr. Malinowski, well, I'd like to thank you and welcome you once again.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
My first question to you is, how do you assess, how do you perceive the communique of the four countries blockading Qatar in their press conference in Cairo today?
Well, I wasn't able to watch the press conference, but from what I have seen of the communique, it is nothing new. The four countries clearly are not ready to back down from the hard line that they've taken, but they don't seem to know where to go next. And I can only hope that what we saw at the press conference and the communique is not the end of the story. I can only hope that there is active mediation going on behind the scenes that will find a solution that avoids conflict and that helps each country to address the concerns that are legitimate. And I can tell you that most of us in the United States, I can't speak for our president right now, but most of us in the United States recognize that there is plenty of blame to go around, and that each of these countries need to do a better job when it comes to what is most important to us, and that is the fight against terrorism.
In the final communique, they did not mention the 13 demands that they had presented earlier. They rather raised 6 other issues. Do you think that they withdrew the 13 demands that they had earlier presented?
Well, I sure hope not. Amongst other things, I hope that this network continues to broadcast, and I certainly hope that no country in the region is forced to shut down media or to turn over the names of activists or political opposition members in other countries with whom they have met. If these are crimes that I have committed as a U.S. official, and that officials of every country in the region have committed. These are, I think, fairly silly in addition to extreme, and my hope is that wiser heads prevail in the 4 countries, and that we start focusing on what the real issues here are.
Do you believe that President Trump's call to the Egyptian President Sisi and his call 2 days ago to other officials of the 4 countries and his call to the Emir of Qatar played a role in the communique that was issued and in the hazy and hesitant communique?
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if leaders of all the countries involved are a bit confused about where President Trump is on this issue. I'm confused. Most Americans are confused. I do think, though, that there are mature, responsible people in the U.S. government, including our Secretary of Defense, General Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, General McMaster, who recognize that this crisis, this blockade, is not in anybody's interest. It's certainly not in America's national interest, and who want to do everything we possibly can to help our friends, including Qatar, resolve it in a reasonable way. And my hope is that leaders in the region will work with Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis and allow the United States to contribute to a mediated solution.
You are not the first U.S. official that I host and that I ask about their opinion about Trump's position. And they say that Trump's position is not understood by many who work or who worked within the U.S. administration. This confusing Trump position, is it real, is it authentic, or is it just an allocation of roles between the Ministry of Defense and the State Department?
I'm very sorry to say that I think it's authentic. I don't think he has a particularly sophisticated understanding of this situation or the history of the region. I think he is very impulsive. I think he tends to like people who praise him, like people who like him, like people who do business with him, and that influenced some of his early statements in support of the Saudi position. But look, this is something we all have to deal with. We have a very non-traditional president of the United States, one who many of us think is, to say the least, quite immature. We can't change that in the short term, but in the meantime, responsible people still have to work on solving problems. And fortunately, most, I think, people in the United States and most people in our government who understand this situation have taken a much more even-handed approach and are working to try to help all sides resolve it in a reasonable way.
Do you believe that Trump gave them the green light to do what they did, and then when they fell into the trap, he called them and asked them to pull themselves out of it? This is why they seemed confused, hazy, unclear in their future vision and the future measures to take against Qatar?
I don't think he knew what he was doing. I don't think he thought he was giving anybody a green light or a red light. But I do think that some of his statements during the summit meeting in Riyadh and his body language, his clear, almost emotional support for the Saudis and their allies was probably taken as a green light to take this step. And now I think some of the responsible people who are working for President Trump are trying to clean up the mess. Again, I think all of us who have an interest in resolving this situation, and I hope that goes for Qatar as well as responsible officials in the other countries, I hope that we will all try to ignore all of that drama and do our best to work with responsible people in the U.S. government to try to resolve this. And look, I can tell you that most of us understand perfectly well that this crisis is not really about the terrorism issue. That's the most important issue for the United States. We think that both Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE can do better in some respects. But I think we all understand that that's not what motivated the blockade. And that's one of the reasons why we do want this blockade to end.
Amongst those who feel responsible in the U.S. administration, and who are those people that you advise that should deal with these countries?
Well, look, I'm a big critic of the Trump administration, so I'm not a great fan of any of these officials. But I do think that on this issue, Secretary of State Tillerson is trying to do the right thing. Secretary of Defense Mattis is trying to do the right thing. They both know the region. They understand that it's not in America's interest for there to be conflict within the GCC. And I think they both know it well enough to recognize that when the Saudis and the Emiratis claim to be acting solely based on a sincere concern about financing of terrorism, that's only a very small part of the picture. It is not in America's national interest to punish Qatar because of its role in the Arab Spring, for example. It's not in America's national interest to see a breakup of the GCC because of a dispute over what happened in Egypt. And it's certainly not in our interest to have countries blackmail other countries in order to get them to shut down news media. That's not what we believe is right. So I think most Americans, even though we all disagree with each other about many things, and I'm a critic of Trump administration on most issues, I think we understand that this needs to be resolved in a responsible and reasonable and even-handed way.
Mr. Tom, you've mentioned that it's not the issue of accusing Qatar of terrorism. It goes way beyond this. Today, in the press conference, they have left everything. They didn't find anything to speak about, and their main focus was that these countries stand against Qatar so that they can preserve international peace, because Qatar seems to be promoting terrorism in the world. In your statement last June 14th, maybe less than a month ago, before the Congress, and in addition, you said that the dispute between KSA and Qatar has nothing to do with terrorism financing, but the fact that Qatar stood by the revolutions of the Arab Spring. Can you truly explain the position of those countries that you've mentioned in your statement, and based on your knowledge and your visits to these countries in the last few years?
Well, I think the what Saudi Arabia and the UAE are most afraid of is really any threat to the established political order in the Middle East. Obviously, terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS pose a threat to that established order, and so they're generally with us in the fight against those terrorist groups. But they are equally, if not more, threatened by organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, which have demonstrated a capacity to gain popular political support and to translate it into effective political movements, and by more liberal movements for democracy and human rights that arose in the region during the Arab Spring. And as you well know, they blame Qatar for supporting all of these challenges to the established order, either through political support or financing or through networks like Al Jazeera. And I think this is the primary motivation.
However, those are not speaking today about ISIL or Qaeda. They're speaking about Muslim Brotherhood that the U.S. Secretary of State refused to call terrorists. In today's press conference, they mainly focused on Muslim Brotherhood. If anybody wanted to cause Mohammed bin Zayed to go hysterical, they would have to mention Muslim Brotherhood before them. The Bahraini Foreign Minister today said the Muslim Brotherhood are terrorists, while the Secretary of State of the United States said we cannot dub them terrorists because they are part of the regimes and the governments in Arab and non-Arab countries. Did you have any contact with the Muslim Brotherhood? Do you see that the fact that these countries categorize the Muslim Brotherhood as being terrorists and the pressure put on Qatar because it doesn't take a hostile position towards Muslim Brotherhood may lead to further escalating this crisis?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat funny when my friend Sheikh Khalid, the foreign minister of Bahrain, condemns the Muslim Brotherhood in those terms when, of course, we know and he knows that we know that the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated parties are sitting in the Bahraini parliament, and they're fairly hardline supporters of the current government and its crackdown on that country's Shia majority. That's just one example that demonstrates how complicated this actually is. And I think, we see this in the United States. We're not fooled by these oversimplifications. We also understand, even those of us like myself who don't have a very favorable opinion of the Muslim Brotherhood, that there is a very big distinction between violent groups, terrorist groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and nonviolent political Islamist parties like the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know that if you conflate all of these different groups and make them into one giant enemy, you are actually encouraging more people to align against you. That we understand that the secret to success against terrorism is to try to isolate those groups that are particularly violent, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and even where possible to enlist political Islamist parties in that effort. So I think we see this partly, one, it's hypocritical, and number two, it's very counterproductive if our primary objective is to protect ourselves from those who are actually trying to kill us.
Why do we see those four countries being very scared, frightened from the revolution of the Arab Spring?
Well, they are authoritarian countries, and they don't want to see the spread of the idea that people should be able to speak freely and choose their leaders and reject their leaders if they don't like them. That is a frightening thought to everybody who rules undemocratically. And by the way, I would say to my Qatari friends here that there is an opportunity here for Qatar to claim the moral high ground, because as you well know, although I think we rightly accuse the Saudis and the Emiratis of many hypocrisies, but it is also true that Qatar has supported Arab Spring movements in other countries. It has not exactly been willing to open up its own political space to dissenting views. And I think that at this moment, when many people around the world are learning about this region and the country of Qatar for the first time, I think there's an opportunity here for Qatar to show that these principles apply to itself as well. I think it would be very, very much in Qatar's interests in the midst of this crisis, to demonstrate a commitment to reforming its own political system, even if only gradually, to show that this freedom of speech experiment of Al Jazeera and others that it supports around the region are not just for others, but also for itself.
What are your demands towards Qatar? What is it that you're asking from Qatar specifically so that it takes the high moral ground and for it to go beyond what those oppressive countries have done, where they called for closing down Al Jazeera, delivering or extraditing the political opponents, some provocative demands, some demands that are not feasible as said by U.S. officials. What is it that you ask of Qatar?
Well, first of all, I completely agree that those demands are unfeasible and just plain wrong. But I do think, and it's not for me to demand. I'm only an observer at this point. But I do think that if there were, for example, greater freedom of speech in Qatar, including the freedom to criticize the current ruler, greater freedom of the press with an internal focus. You have networks like Al Jazeera that demonstrate great freedom and openness in talking about the problems of the region, which is threatening to the Saudis, but I think very commendable from our point of view. But I think the focus of these networks has rarely turned inside to the situation inside Qatar. Now, I know there was a case recently in which a prominent critic who was imprisoned for criticizing the emir was then pardoned. I think that was a very good step. But I think it would be a brilliant move on Qatar's part if it took advantage of the attention that this crisis is generating to announce some internal reforms, particularly in the area of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of assembly. I think that would help Qatar seize the moral high ground. Because right now it sort of seems like everybody in the region is pointing their finger at everybody else, and nobody is holding up a mirror. And I think the country that is seen as holding up a mirror in the most honest way is the country that will emerge from this crisis with the strongest international reputation.
I would like to thank you, and I hope that the officials and decision makers in Qatar and that His Highness the Emir and anybody who listens to us today notice these points that you've mentioned, especially that you've been visiting these countries and you know the human rights and the cases of human rights here. However, I have a transparent question to you. The 4 other countries have full prisons of more than 100,000 political people arrested, like Egypt. The same for the UAE. Even in Saudi Arabia, for a simple tweet, people may be condemned to years in jail. Are there political people arrested, political detainees in Qatar in view of your experience today? Are there current political detainees?
Yes, there have been. There have been. Well, I'm not as current as I used to be. I'm a civilian now.
Can you
and not a State
mention one
Department
person?
official, but our no, because I'm not current. But I would definitely, I would encourage you to read the latest reports of the State Department and Amnesty International. I would not compare the situation in Qatar to the situation in Egypt. I think that is fair, where there are thousands and thousands of detainees and significant use of torture.
Don't
but
compare
again, I
with
think,
Egypt. Let's compare with other Gulf countries. I'm giving you the right to
Well, I think
criticize Qatar. We have enough freedom in Al Jazeera to criticize Qatar on Al Jazeera. We are not here to defend Qatar specifically. We are defending the freedom of expression, human beings in general, even within Qatar.
Again, without making comparisons, because each country is unique and has its own problems, there was the case, and this was the case I was most familiar with when I was Assistant Secretary of State, involving the writer who wrote, I believe it was a poem criticizing the emir, and was sentenced to, I think, about 15 years in prison. And as I mentioned, he was pardoned, which is a heartening decision. But the laws under which he was prosecuted are still on the books. And this is what I mean when I talk about the need for reform. And the fact that one country may be better than another country with respect to human rights, that's a debate that gets us nowhere. It's not very constructive. The United States respects human rights more than most countries in the world, but we have injustices in our country, and when they happen, we need to correct them, even though we may be better than Russia or China. So I think we all have to tend to our own affairs and to our own reputation. And I think, and I'm making not just a principled point, but a political point, that I think it would benefit Qatar a great deal if, in the middle of this crisis, when the whole world is paying attention to this small country, perhaps for the first time, that you show a commitment to reform on these issues. Another matter that I think will be very, very important in terms of Qatar's reputation is, of course, the World Cup, when the whole world will be focused on particularly the issue of labor rights and rights of migrants in Qatar. This is something that I spoke to the government of Qatar about when I was at the State Department. I know some progress has been made. Some very positive, concrete steps have been taken. But this is another area where Qatar has an opportunity, I think, to show that it is ahead of its neighbors in terms of affording protections to migrants and migrant workers in particular.
Mr. Malinowski, just for clarification, you know that the issue you raised, this poet was not imprisoned because he criticized the emir. Many criticized the emir and the government, even on Twitter. But as you know all too well, is that he had violated the dignity and the honor of people. And this is something that is criminalized in the Gulf and the Arab world. I just wanted to clarify that he was not a political detainee. However, he had insulted and offended. Now, with everything that those countries doing, those countries that fight the Arab Spring, have they succeeded in putting an end to the revolutions of the Arab Spring, or are the Arab Spring revolutions are still simmering under the ashes and they will take these oppressive regimes by a storm?
I don't think anyone in the world wants to live in a country where they don't have a voice in their government. I don't think anyone wants to live in a country where officials can abuse them or engage in corruption with impunity. That's what the Arab Spring was about. People haven't changed. And in those countries where those desires have been suppressed, they will reemerge. And people, I think, will find ways to continue to challenge the established political order. I can say that as an American, it is very much in my country's interest that the challenge come from democratic forces, from those who who want to build societies based on the rule of law. Because if those forces are not allowed to rise again, other much more destructive forces will emerge as the chief opponents of the current political order. So either the challenge will come from those who champion democracy and the rule of law, or it will come from ISIS and al-Qaeda. And our interest is very much in the former happening, not the latter.
What are your expectations regarding the U.S. Reaction if France, Germany, and the U.K. call on the United States to close the CNN or CNBC or Fox News because it disturbs them?
Well, that would be ridiculous. Of course, we would not do that. And you know, it's again, I look back to my experience as an American diplomat. I often found myself urging countries in the Gulf and outside the Gulf in the Middle East to not shut down newspapers and magazines and television stations that were criticizing them. And the response was usually, well, you know, you have no right to talk to us about our press. That's something that we will deal with ourselves. So apparently it's not okay to tell Bahrain, for example, that it should not shut down an independent newspaper, but it's okay for Bahrain to tell Qatar that it should shut down a television station or a newspaper. So I find that somewhat amusing, but also, of course, quite sad.
In your perception as a U.S. diplomat and politician who knows the region too well, why do they want to shut Jazeera down?
Because you set an example that they don't want their own media to follow. And because you give voice to people who, whose voices they would like to see suppressed. It's very, very simple.
Studies show that they have launched, after Al Jazeera was established 20 years ago or more than that, launched more than 100 satellite TV channels. Why have these 100 satellite TV channels failed after they had been launched to stand in front of Al Jazeera? Why have they failed, and why did they choose as a solution to shut Jazeera down?
Well, I don't want to be a media critic. Comparing the quality of various news channels. All I can say is that you know, this channel, it's been criticized by many people. It probably has made many mistakes over the years, but you have provided a forum for free debate for people from around the region. And that's obviously threatening to governments that don't like free debate. And I think that's why it's so important that the international community, even if we may sometimes criticize Al Jazeera for its coverage of a particular issue, that we defend any media outlet that comes under this kind of pressure to simply shut down.
Do you expect that the Gulf and the GCC to return to how they used to be before the crisis, or do you think we are facing new political maps and alliances in the region?
Well, you know, we need, and by we I mean the United States, but I also think the people of the region, we need unity in the face of the real threats that we face in common. We all face a real threat from terrorists who are trying to kill us. We all face a threat from forces in Iran that are interfering in neighboring countries. We all share an interest in trying to resolve the remaining conflicts in the region, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the situation in Libya and in Yemen. And we do not need to manufacture an artificial crisis in the middle of these real crises. We need unity in the face of these threats.
How do you perceive the scenarios that the blockade countries may consider after they had shown up hazy and confused today? They spoke about a meeting in Bahrain that they did not specify, and they don't seem to know the next steps. What are the scenarios before them today to abide by Trump's orders to them to enter negotiations and solve the crisis?
I think the only reasonable way out is to focus on what may be a legitimate common interest in strengthening the fight against terrorism. Now, I think we agree that that wasn't the primary motivation for the Saudis and the Emiratis when they imposed the blockade, but they said that that was the motivation, and so let's just pretend that it is and come up with a package of steps that not just Qatar but all countries in the region can take to tighten rules against financing terrorist groups even further. All countries have taken some steps, but it's still a problem. There's still money laundering going on. There's still fundraising going on for extremist groups, including in Syria. That can be addressed. I think perhaps there could be common understanding of how to deal with some of the regional crises, like, for example, in Libya, where both sides, I have to say, have been quite irresponsible over the years in supporting one armed group against another. Perhaps an understanding can emerge here that all of the GCC members should, rather than supporting General Haftar or the militias in Tripoli, that they should actually support a unified and democratic Libyan government, which is what we have been working for some years. So maybe this is wishful thinking, but sometimes out of crisis, good things can come. And my hope is that if this goes to real mediation, the minds of all the parties can be made to focus on the real problems that I think we all honestly must acknowledge exist in the region.
Don't you think that the U.S. administration bears a political and moral responsibility for having supported these oppressive and dictatorships against the will of the Arab peoples when they had taken action in the Arab Spring?
Well, we have been blamed for supporting them too much and for opposing them too much. We certainly did support oppressive regimes in the region for many, many years. We do have common interests with Saudi Arabia, obviously, in defending the security of the Gulf and fighting terrorism and countering irresponsible actions by Iran. But at the same time, we found out the hard way that the policies of these authoritarian states were hurting us in the long run. That's why President Obama in 2011 embraced the Arab Spring. He praised the protesters in Egypt and called on, for example, at that point, President Mubarak to step down. For that support, we have not been forgiven by our friends in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. All I know is that it is in all of our interest for all of the authoritarian monarchies in the region to move towards greater pluralism, greater respect for the human rights of all people, whether that is Saudi Arabia or Bahrain or the UAE or Qatar. It doesn't matter to me or to us. It is a movement that we very much want to see resume in the region. And frankly, I fear that the alternative since the status quo cannot be maintained forever, the alternative is that change will be pushed by much more violent and much more radical actors. And that is something we should all be working together to avoid.
You've made many statements before the Congress against al-Sisi regime. Today, 4 years have gone by after the bloody coup that was led by Sisi, and the last statement you made before the Congress was on April 26 on Egypt, and then you spoke about the crisis between KSA and Qatar. However, on April 26, you said that the Sisi government is one of the most difficult developing countries, governments that you've dealt with when it comes to democracy and human rights. How do you assess the 4 years of Sisi's regime in terms of corruption, oppression, extrajudicial killings, corrupt judiciary, violations of human rights?
My assessment is that the people of Egypt in 2011 rose up against military rule. They demanded a government that would be more honest and more accountable to them and to the law. And what they have now is exactly what they rose up against. They have a military government in which corruption is the law of the land, and that is imprisoning under very brutal conditions thousands and thousands of people. And I'm afraid that the long-term consequences of this are going to be terrible for all of us. In those prisons, and this is a very practical problem, in those prisons you have side by side liberal democratic activists, supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, and supporters of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the Al-Qaeda guys and the ISIS guys are looking at the youth who supported political parties or other political movements and telling them, you fools, you idiots, that you should ever have trusted in peaceful democratic politics to make change in this country. Our path, the violent path, is the only one that will work. And I'm afraid that that message is going to be very effective, at least for some of those youth under those circumstances. We tried to make this point to the Sisi government in the Obama administration. Maybe we didn't do it effectively or strongly enough, but we did try. We now have a president who very much embraces what President Sisi is trying to do, which I think is very, very unfortunate.
When I followed your reports back when you were an assistant State Secretary regarding human rights, the Sisi government was replying to your reports in a very angry way, in a very emotional way, without answering the content of the report. It always considered itself innocent, as if it were the oppressed government that is being criticized and terrorized. And until today, and maybe Trump gave them the opportunity to even increase their crimes against the Egyptian people.
Yes, I think I did make that point in my testimony to the Congress. Look, it was my job to have arguments with governments around the world that abuse human rights. And oftentimes I found, and I have to say with Saudi Arabia, with Bahrain, with the UAE, I felt like I could always have a serious conversation. We didn't always agree. Sometimes I criticized them, but they took our views seriously and respectfully, and sometimes we were able to make progress on particular issues. With Egypt, I just felt a wall of denial and defiance and arrogance, and to the point where it almost felt like it was not worth it to have the conversation with them. Look, this is first and foremost a tragedy for the Egyptian people, and one that they will have to find a way to resolve. But I think all of us in the international community do have a role to play by continuing to keep these human rights issues front and center. If President Trump won't do it, others in the United States will, our Congress will. I hope that other countries in the region are open to human rights scrutiny, that they all try to set a good example, which is why I had that exchange with you on Qatar, and that we will get back to a better situation in the coming years.
How do you categorize the Sisi regime in terms of oppression, and how do you perceive its future?
Well, you know, it's very hard to assess popular opinion in a country where freedom of speech does not really exist. Oftentimes, a dictator will appear to be very, very strong, will appear to be very popular, because people don't feel like they can say what they truly think. And then suddenly, something changes, very suddenly. And we realize that the foundations of that apparently strong order were actually very, very weak. And of course, that's what happened in 2011. Many people were taken by surprise by how quickly the Mubarak regime and the Gaddafi regime and others in the region fell. So I think the curse of every dictator is that they have to live with tremendous insecurity every single day. They're not, you know, unlike an elected president, they don't know how long they're going to rule because things could change at any given moment. And that sometimes leads them to behave even more harshly, even more impulsively towards their opposition. So I guess if you force me to make a prediction, I would say that Egypt, like most authoritarian dictatorships, will appear to be perfectly stable until the day that it's not. And then we will all look back and ask ourselves why we didn't see it coming.
I loved your last sentences where you described a democratic ruler knows when he is expired, while the dictator thinks that he's going to last forever until his day comes, such as Gaddafi, Ben Ali, Mubarak, and many dictatorships ending, as we've seen. I got tens of questions from our viewers. My discussion with you took most of the time. I have a few questions left. Amongst those questions, and maybe a question that you had already answered, Mr. Ahmed Al-Awadi is asking you, don't these dictatorships know that oppression and dictatorships cause terrorism? Do you agree with him? We only have 1 minute left. Do you agree with the saying whereby those oppressive dictatorships have played a role in the promotion of terrorism?
Well, I think that they do. Now, I don't think that most terrorists, most ISIS fighters, for example, are in fact genuinely motivated by a desire to oppose tyranny. But I do think that the antidote to ISIS, the antidote to Al-Qaeda, is civil society. It is the people of a country empowered to make decisions for themselves and for their countries. And when you give the people the space to do that, then you are empowering the vast majority of people who are moderate, who are reasonable, who are nonviolent, and by definition disempowering those who only know how to get their way through violence. But if you shut down that space for democratic debate, for political parties, for free media, for civil society groups, then the only people who can enter the space are those who are adept at working secretly, who are adept at conspiracy, who are adept at violence. So I think that is the equation that connects dictatorship to terrorism.
Tom Malinowski, the Assistant Secretary of State during the the Obama administration, and a writer of speeches and statements to former secretaries Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher, and the senior official when it comes to writing speeches and the Security Council and the National Security Council. Thank you so much. We would like to welcome you once again and thank you for following us.
Thank you very much.